But I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. This is a work in progress. Robert has finished his work, and it's a nice thing to send it off to the publisher and say, this is somewhat finished. This is definitely right in the middle of this project. And I really wanted to thank Pete and Robert for the opportunity to get together, because for me, at this point, it's really, really helpful to be able to share what I've found so far and get feedback and think about what the next steps are. I began this project, as Pete mentioned, here at the Seminary Ridge Museum. And it really started with a list of names, a very modest list of names of the surgeons who we knew had been at the seminary. So we started doing research on them, then we started doing a little more research. The more I found out about them, the more curious I got about who else there was, how they interacted with other people. And before you know it, I was engaged in looking and trying to identify all of the Union surgeons who were here at Gettysburg and all of the Confederate surgeons who were here at Gettysburg. And the next thing that happened was I started seeing references to the volunteers and the people afterwards. So I now have 3 databases that are trying to identify who was here at Gettysburg and involved in care of the wounded during the battle and afterwards. In retrospect, I started out not with a thesis to prove something or for a specific idea, but really just curious, who were these people? Because I never could find a complete list. So it's really been a bottom-up approach and following where the individual stories lead. So in retrospect, I've actually clarified how this approach differs from some other research on Civil War medicine. And very helpful to me was William Rothstein, who is the author of American Physicians in the 19th Century. And it was published in 1985, which is not so old, but not so new either. But he identified 3 different ways to approach medical history, and I found this really, really helpful. He said, one is the development of medical knowledge and technology. What did the doctors know? And in a lot of ways, that's what Shauna Devine's book has helped us really sort through. What was the state of medical knowledge at the time, or at any time? The second is the health of the populace and the impact of medical care on patients. So a lot of what you see in the medical history is really looking at case studies. What was the care for a particular disease, or were they doing amputations, that sort of thing. The third approach is the behavior of individual physicians as members of a profession. And this approach is one that he said has really been neglected in the past. And I think it's interesting because it actually is really what Robert was talking about as well, which is this kind of anthropological approach. So my project is, rather than one biography of a famous physician, which there are some, or even a single diarist who has left an account, I've set out to find everything I can about the entire group of surgeons who were at the Battle of Gettysburg. And in a way, it's not unlike an anthropological approach to looking at these individual experiences. From the start, I realized that the Union and Confederate surgeons were part of one profession. They might be 2 armies, but they're one profession. And their experiences were so similar that there was no need to separate them at all. So I know there's doctors in gray and there's doctors in blue, but I found that there was no reason to separate them. Their experiences as a class of people and as doctors, they were really united and very similar. But the first thing I needed to know, I couldn't do this work without names. I needed to know who they were to start. So to find names of surgeons, I started with secondary sources, Greg Coco, A Vast Sea of Misery. I'm sure many of you have looked at that. And Roland Mouse, Grappling with Death on the Second Corps. Both have some really good lists. They name names. But no one of those lists was complete. And even fewer Confederates are identified, except for Kent Masterson Brown's retreat from Gettysburg. And I have to admit that I really didn't read the text much. I was looking at the notes where he lists all of the doctors' names, which was very, very helpful. Terry Hambrecht's Virtual Cemetery of Confederate Physicians in Find a Grave is a tremendous source for date, service records in medical school, later career, and more importantly, Terry was willing to share his lists of Confederate surgeons who served in regiments that were at Gettysburg with me, which really speeded up my process very much. Because I didn't have, on the Union side, there's Straight's roster of Civil War surgeons, which lists all the surgeons who were in different regiments. And that was my starting place for the Union. But even that is not complete because it was published in order for veterans to find their regimental surgeon for their, to get a pension. And so if a doctor was deceased in 1887 when it was published, they're not included. So no list was complete, but they were very helpful starting points. In addition, I've tried to find supporting evidence from accounts, letters, service records, anything that would place people at Gettysburg and verify not just their military history, which can be a little sketchy sometimes and not always accurate, were they actually here? So all of that has been very helpful. And we talked about technology, and I know that 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I could not have done this project. Because without Ancestry, without Fold3, without plain old Google, I would never have been able to track these people down or find the information I have. Certainly not in 5 years. It would have maybe been 50 years, and then probably not. So to date, I have identified with a fair degree of certainty 650 Union surgeons, which corresponds with Jonathan Letterman's report, as well as 439 Confederate surgeons and assistant surgeons whose records can reasonably confirm their presence at Gettysburg. And I have another 87 names who represent physicians who worked at Gettysburg after the battle. So I pretty quickly realized that I was going to have to develop a methodology for identifying and documenting what now amounts to about 1,200 surgeons, individual physicians. So I use a FileMaker Pro software to create 3 databases. Each one includes basic demographics, birth, death dates, medical school, date of graduation. So in order to do this, so how to organize, setting up a database can be difficult. The military ones turned out to be pretty easy because I just loaded in the order of battle. That gave me the structure for the database. Then it was just a question of finding names for each one of those regiments and then verifying which ones were or were not at Gettysburg. Pretty simple. For each doctor, and I have an individual record that includes their birth, death dates, education, date of their medical degree, references with notes from Ancestry. I can cut and paste. It's a wonderful database because it takes unlimited text, so I can just put things right in there and search on any field. So it really allows me now to play with it now that I have it structured. More difficult were the contract and volunteer physicians who came afterwards. They don't have a structure to put in. I don't know when I'm done. I don't know what's complete. So it really has been much more catch as catch can, just finding names wherever I can. Central to this story is Dr. Henry James, who is in the center, who took charge of the Gettysburg hospitals following the battle. His papers provided information about patient histories, but more importantly, the patient's histories had a doctor's name next to them, so I was able to verify and get names of doctors who were working under him. So it's also more difficult because there's such a range of backgrounds for the people who come after the battle. First of all, we have regimental surgeons who remained, like Dr. Fulton, who is assigned, and that's his job, to stay behind after the battle. There are also USA Army volunteers, regular Army, and William Fisher Norris is an example of that. He also figures in the diary because he's at the Catholic Church. But he's a new newly recruited assistant surgeon coming out of Philadelphia hospitals and is there from July 10th to the 27th. Then there's acting assistant surgeons or contract surgeons, and Silas Ware Mitchell is an example of that. And he, again, is sent out. They're being sent out from the Philadelphia and Washington hospitals. There's a number of them. Then we have volunteers with the Christian Commission or the Sanitary Commission. And one of those is up in the, where is he? This fellow is Bushrod Washington James, who was with the Christian Commission. And he came on July 7th, one of the earliest to arrive with supplies. But he only lasted 5 days, from the 7th to the 12th. He had to leave because he was debilitated due to the water, the foul water, polluted water. He was very ill. And he's interesting because we're talking about backgrounds, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But he was a graduate of the Homeopathic Medical College of Philadelphia. So interesting difference there. More difficult even than these folks, which I find in the official records, are volunteers who came on their own. And one example of that is Dr. Mary Walker Edwards, or Edwards Walker, I got it mixed up. Mary Edwards Walker, sorry for that. There is no official record of her being in Gettysburg. However, Dr. Walker, who graduated from the Syracuse Medical College, which was an eclectic college in 1855, volunteered as an assistant surgeon. She's quite well known because she eventually did receive a commission as a contract surgeon and received a Medal of Honor. Her history during this period of time is very sketchy, and the only account which we had that I've seen before was one from Liberty Hollinger, who lived here in Gettysburg, and talked and left a memoir that said, one of the familiar figures of the streets in those days that interested us very much was Dr. Mary Walker. Her low silk hat with bloomers and a man's coat and collar seemed invariably to call forth a laugh or a yell from the young boys and many a smile and shrug from the older people. Well, a lot of people have discounted this. It was an account that was given later. Maybe she was making it up. In my research, I've run across 3 or 4 more references to her. A letter from Charles Merrick, who was a hospital steward in the Second Corps Hospital, to his wife, who is also a female, became a female physician, described women volunteers, and also one abominable bloomer is visible occasionally. This was July 10th. Peter Tinsley, a chaplain with the 28th Virginia, talked about she-doctors and others we have met have bloomer costumes encroaching more or less on male attire. This again, July 10th, same day. And even more convincingly, there is a letter from Frederick Law Olmsted to dated July 15th, 1863, when he writes, quote, I enclose a note about the position from one of our inspectors written on Monday, July 13th. It would have been July 13th, Monday. The hermaphrodite medico means Miss Walker, M.D., Doctoress Walker, Walker, M.D. on the warpath, as one of our hours describes her. So I think that's pretty clear that she was in Gettysburg. Interestingly, I found another note from another physician who was at Gettysburg, George Potter of the 145th Pennsylvania, in September, when he's now back in Virginia with, they're back in Virginia, and he says, Dr. Mary Walker rode up to the hospital just at dusk last evening, and I gave her quarters for the night. She appears to be one of those women cranks who imagine they have a mission to perform in the Army and so pester the doctors with their care. So how long she stayed in Gettysburg, I don't know, but she was definitely on the move again in September. So now that the databases have been compiled, what can they tell us? So let me give you just a few of the big takeaways. One is that the largest number of surgeons in my database fall within the age range of 22 to 35 in 1863. And probably 1835 is one of the most common birth dates that I find. And James Fulton falls right into that. 1832 is his birth date, so he's right in the middle. But there are outliers that range in age from the 60-year-olds and veterans of the Mexican War to 20-year-old recent graduates. So the oldest was Thomas Sim, who was USA Medical Director of the 3rd Corps. On the Union side, John Work was Assistant Surgeon, CSA, for the 1st Texas Infantry, and he was in the Mexican War, so he's in the Mexican War. The youngest in the Union, they were born in 1843 and include 2 Canadians, which is kind of interesting. But the youngest of the CSA surgeons, who is born in 1842, was probably the youngest surgeon that I've found. He was graduated from Atlanta Medical College in 1860 and was appointed assistant surgeon in October 1862 and passed the examination for surgeon in April 1863. So that was pretty young. The other takeaway is their education. Contrary to a lot of references to untrained or unprepared Civil War surgeons, the individuals who served here at Gettysburg represented a remarkably well-educated group of doctors for their time. 92% of Union surgeons and 88% of Confederate surgeons either received an MD degree or took an equivalent number of courses from a medical college. It's interesting, I was just at Chimborazo, and they were giving 70% as college degrees for surgeons, I guess, at Chimborazo. And it's possible that, so this seems even a little bit higher than that. The Gettysburg surgeons attended 70 different medical schools from Boston to New Orleans, from Philadelphia to Keokuk, Iowa. 2 Philadelphia schools, the University of Pennsylvania and Fulton's alma mater, Jefferson Medical College, stand out as having the most attendees overall, with almost 35% or 415 of all the surgeons, both Union and Confederate. So they really account for a huge number of the surgeons here at Gettysburg. What about college education? There's Fulton attended 2 years at least. Maybe we're not sure about whether he graduated or not. He did graduate. So Castleton Medical College did an analysis of their graduates, and 4.7% had a previous college degree, and about 6.2% had 1 or 2 years of college. The surgeons at Gettysburg appeared to have had a somewhat better educational background. They were 8.7% of Confederates and 12.7% of Union surgeons had a college degree, and 6.3% and 4.6% had some college training. So that's a good number. The majority of all of the surgeons, both Confederate and Union, prepared for medical school with a college preparatory education by attending one of the many local seminaries, academies, grammar schools, or preparatory programs of 4-year colleges that offered English and classical studies. And at first I was very confused. Seminaries, academies, what are we talking about? And the common schools. So common schools are the primary education, and then really it's a high school and what we would almost think of as 2 years of college, because they're learning Latin and Greek. And one of the things I read was that some of these academies were actually better preparation for science because the liberal arts schools did not deal with science, and they were more technical. So sometimes they were a better preparation for medical school than actually a 4-year liberal arts college. Kind of interesting. The biggest difference in education is about class and where they are in the economic scale. So someone like William Riddick Whitehead, who was surgeon for the 44th Virginia, comes from a very, very wealthy family. He graduated from VMI, attended the University of Virginia, got his MD degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Then he goes to Paris to study for a while. And for a year, he's a surgeon with the Russian army in the Crimean War. Then goes back to Paris, completes his degree, not just classes, but actually gets a medical degree from Paris, and then comes back to serve in the Confederate Army. On the other end of the economic spectrum, Warren Underwood, who was assistant surgeon for the 151st Pennsylvania, was a local boy. He was born in Dillsburg, York County. His father was a whip maker who died when he was young. He was educated in the normal school. Then he taught in the common schools for a while. And one of the things I've discovered looking at in the census records is I'd find one of these doctors, and all of a sudden he's a school teacher. What's he doing being, he's a school teacher? Well, what I've discovered is people who were of lesser means often went and taught school for several years to make enough money to go to medical school. That was a very common way to do that. So I began to see that as a pattern. So he was one of those that taught. He studied medicine with his under Dr. Ira Day of Cumberland County, attended Jefferson Medical College for just 1 year and didn't graduate, and signed up to become a surgeon in the Union Army. Interestingly, he got a 6 on his exam, which would indicate that he had some proficiency. And he didn't get his medical degree until after the war. So he went back after his service. I think it was 1864. The other interesting thing that I've discovered is how much the medical corps was changing over the 4 years. So one thing to think about is why look at the surgeons at Gettysburg? Why not the surgeons at Antietam or the surgeons at any time? Gettysburg is kind of an interesting case study because it's kind of in the middle of the war. It's kind of the high watermark for the medical corps of both of the armies. The Letterman system is in place. The Confederates have gone through a purging and insisting that all their surgeons be examined. A lot of people leave. They have new people. So this is probably maybe represents the high point for their care. So it is interesting that it's probably a different group of people than might have been there a year before or even 2 years later. So it is a moment in time, and it's something to realize. The other thing that was an interesting takeaway was how much more diversity there was of medical theory within the armies themselves than we have thought. So it turns out not all of the surgeons were allopaths, which kind of blows the official account. And the Civil War Medical Corps may be a more accurate reflection of some of the dynamic and contentious nature of medicine in the mid-19th century. So William Hammond's circular removed calomel and tartar emetic from drugs with an outcry from traditional allopaths and praise from eclectics and botanicals. That was a pretty big step to take at that time. Francis Porcher's book of medicinal plants for the Confederates was not developed in a vacuum, and I looked up, and there's at least 5 botanical schools in the South at the time. So this was not an unknown quantity of things. And then John Julian Chisholm's Manual of Military Surgery was arguing against bloodletting and really for a much more hands-off kind of approach, which again was much more of a reform kind of thing than traditional allopathic treatment at the time. So I was surprised to find irregular and homeopathic surgeons who served in the Union Army. 7 surgeons were students of homeopathic colleges in Cleveland, Philadelphia, and St. Louis. 10 surgeons were students of 4 eclectic colleges located in New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, and 3 attended the Hygiotherapeutic College of New York, or hydropaths. So Sometimes they got around it by being able to take the examination and get a high enough grade because they were well enough trained. Sometimes someone who had a degree from one of the irregular schools, as they were called, would also take a course at one of the regular medical schools so that they could use that as a credential as well. So there's a combination of both. And maybe the most shocking thing, or most unexpected thing I found, were the many references to African Americans in letters and journals and diaries. So I expected that the Confederates would have had black servants, slave or free. What I wasn't prepared for was how many of the Union surgeons also had black servants. And the thing that set me off on this was this photograph, which is in the Army in Carlisle at the library. And it's George Stern Osborne, who was previously assistant surgeon of the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry and was at Gettysburg. These are all three of them, four of the surgeons were at Reedville General Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts at the time that this was taken. So it's kind of later in the war. And it just says, and servant. But there are many others. So, for example, Samuel Glasgow Welch, 13th South Carolina, wrote about his servant, Wilson, who got lost in Maryland. And he says in his letter, I don't think it was his intention to leave. He was negligent about keeping up. And in contrast, Dr. Theodore Tate, who was a surgeon from Gettysburg and was here at Gettysburg in his capacity, also had a black servant. Nelson Royer, who was with him here in Gettysburg and then later joined the USCT, and after the war came back and was a resident of Gettysburg. So it's kind of interesting, and I'm trying to just keep track of all of those because I think together it's going to be another interesting way of looking at one of the really neglected aspects. We know that there were many, many African Americans involved with both armies, but they're nameless and faceless. So anytime I can find a name or a face, it becomes a really another piece of this puzzle. So Silas Weir Mitchell, who is one of Robert's favorite people I know, was a great proponent for telling the story of the surgeons. And he says, except to our technical story, we alone are unrecorded. And he talks about telling the story of the surgeons. So assembling the information in these databases has led me to new and emerging stories about the surgeons at Gettysburg that are both expected and unexpected, military and medical. The database is the first step, but it really has helped me then pose some new questions. But what I really want to say, and that I have learned, is that whatever in this project, the story that emerging is not my story. It really is their story, and they demand that I tell it their way. So here's some of the questions that I have to look at. I wonder why they joined. I know that some clearly on both sides enlisted for patriotic and political reasons. Some were looking for advancement in their medical education. Financial issues may have been an issue. It wasn't very, being a doctor wasn't very high paying, especially for some of the northern doctors in small towns. And it actually paid pretty well to be in the Army compared to what you could make as a doctor. And there's some that are obviously out for adventure. So Andrew Jackson Ward was someone who was in the Mexican War, then the Gold Rush, and when the war started was among the first to enlist. So there's kind of a pattern. You can see there's an interest in adventure, that they are adventurers, they're not the stay-home guys. I'm interested in Army life. What was it like for the surgeons? What was the day-to-day? And I've been very interested in the there's a lot of commentary in their diaries and letters about the difference between being with with the regimental surgeon versus going to a hospital. Some want one, some want the other, and I think that's really interesting to think about the pluses and minuses of that and why people would prefer one or the other. The battle and its aftermath. What were the surgeons doing? It's, again, there's 3 days of battle, and then a long period of time till November when the last of the patients. So what's going on in those months after the battle when the surgeons are here, and that's part of their story. It's interesting because Fulton stayed on, others left. Who comes in? That's all very interesting to plot. And it's only really possible by looking at these individual stories to say who's here when, who leaves, how long they stay, when they go on to rejoin. I'm also interested in prisoners. Surgeons were non-combatants. They're supposed to be treated differently. If any of you have done much on Civil War history, you know that the whole issue of prisoners was a big mess from beginning to end. And the surgeons are even more complicated because as combatants, how are they treating them? What's going on? There were about 100 Confederate surgeons who were held captured and were prisoners and stayed here at Gettysburg to help with the wounded and then go on to Fort McHenry. They're not released until November. I know of at least 2 Union surgeons who were taken prisoner at the Battle of Gettysburg and weren't released until January. So those are really interesting to pursue, to see more about what the back and forth is and the backstory on that. And then after the war, what happens to them? I'm really trying to follow each one of these surgeons right to death. So the ones that die in the 20th century, I actually have their death certificates, what they died from. Many of them went on to become leaders. Some of them left medicine completely and became bankers and businessmen. Some went into politics. They often do become very influential in their communities as health officers, as coroners. But not everybody prospered. J. Franklin Dyer, for example, from the 19th Massachusetts, struggled to rebuild his medical practice and regain his health, and eventually died of tuberculosis at 52 in 1879. Opium and alcohol abuse were problems for some, and that comes through. George Moffett King, CSA surgeon, 18th Virginia, died in 1869 from effects of laudanum while taking a cure. He was at a spa, a cure sanitarium. James L. Farley, one of my favorites, was surgeon of the 14th New York, and his death was reported in February 15, 1886 as headline, possibly another case of the bad effects of cocaine. So there was definitely issues of post and stress, etc. Many surgeons, both North and South, but especially former Confederates, moved west rather than return home after the war, settling in Texas, California, new territories. Some went to Europe afterwards, not really being comfortable staying in the United States. Some abandoned medicine, as I mentioned. Some did very well as druggists. There was a burgeoning profession of drugstores. And, you know, there was a whole group that died within 10 years of the war, probably as results of disease and debilitation from their service. Others live way into old age, into their 80s and 90s, and die of basically old age, heart disease and things like that. So the next steps for my project is completing this database. It's getting there, but you know, there's always more to add. And continuing to gather information. I want to find a permanent home to place this database eventually and to publish it as a digital publication. And what does that mean for an old person that didn't grow up in the digital age? This is like a new frontier. And also then to find ways to publish books, articles, talk about these individuals. Some of these individuals really probably merit much more investigation just in their own right. And most of all, to share this information with colleagues, because I think this is a conversation that we need to have more of. And all these little details that I've collected, added to other details, really begin to expand this story into something that is much more meaningful. So thank you.